Sophia woke up every morning to the same thought. I can't do this. At 35, despite having a brilliant career, the voice inside her head kept pulling her back. She had turned down her boss's promotion offer for the third time. Even when her friends asked, "Why do you do this?" she couldn't explain it. That is, until one day when a note she threw in the trash at the office would change her life forever. The note sat crumpled at the bottom of her wastebasket for 3 days. Sophia had written it during a particularly difficult meeting, where her boss Richard had once again approached her about taking on the role of Senior Director of Marketing. It was a position she'd been working toward for years. At least that's what everyone thought. But when Richard slid the offer letter across the conference table with a warm smile and said, "Sophia, you've earned this," she felt her chest tighten, her hands went cold, and instead of feeling excited, she felt terrified. Later that afternoon, alone in her office, she had grabbed a yellow sticky note and written just 5 words. "Why am I so afraid?" She stared at those words for maybe 10 minutes, then crumpled the paper and tossed it away like it was contaminated. But those words wouldn't leave her mind. They echoed through her thoughts, during dinner, during her evening workout, and especially when she tried to fall asleep that night. Sophia had always been the girl who had it together. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she was the straight-A student, the reliable friend, the daughter who made her parents proud. She'd graduated from a good university with honors, landed a job at a respected marketing firm in Chicago right out of college, and steadily climbed the ladder. On paper, her life looked perfect. On the inside, she felt like a fraud waiting to be exposed. The morning after throwing away that note, Sophia arrived at work early as usual. She liked getting to the office before everyone else. It gave her time to prepare to make sure everything was perfect before the day officially started. As she settled into her chair with her coffee, she noticed the wastebasket beside her desk. For some reason she couldn't explain, she reached down and pulled out the crumpled yellow note. The words were still there. "Why am I so afraid?" This time, instead of throwing it away, she smoothed it out on her desk, and underneath the original question she wrote another, "What am I really afraid of?" She stared at the paper, pen hovering, waiting for an answer to come, but nothing did. So she put the note in her desk drawer and tried to focus on work. That entire week, Sophia couldn't shake the questions she'd written. They followed her everywhere. During client presentations, she would suddenly think, "What if they realize I don't actually know what I'm doing?" When her team praised her work, she would think, "They're just being nice. It wasn't that good." And when Richard sent her an email checking in about the promotion decision, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. By Friday evening, Sophia sat in her apartment, staring at her laptop screen. She had typed "impostor syndrome" into Google about an hour ago and had been reading ever since. Article after article described exactly what she was feeling, the sense that despite evidence of competence, you believe you're a fraud, that any success is due to luck, not skill, that eventually people will figure out you don't deserve to be where you are. As she read, tears started rolling down her cheek. She wasn't crying because she was sad. Exactly. She was crying because for the first time in her life, she realized she wasn't alone in feeling this way. The articles talked about high-achieving women in particular, how they often struggled with these feelings despite remarkable accomplishments, how they turned down opportunities, stayed in positions beneath their skill level, and lived in constant fear of being found out. One article mentioned something called limiting beliefs, deeply held convictions about ourselves and the world that constrain our choices and behaviors. The author explained that these beliefs usually form early in life, often from a single comment, experience, or observation that our young minds internalize and accept as absolute truth. Once formed, these beliefs operate like invisible rules that govern what we think we can and cannot do. Sophia closed her laptop and walked to her kitchen. As she poured herself a glass of wine, a memory surfaced that she hadn't thought about in years. She was 7 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, doing homework. Her father stood behind her, looking over her shoulder at a math problem she'd gotten wrong. He didn't yell or get angry. He just sighed, a long, disappointed sigh, and said, "Sophia, you need to work harder. Smart isn't enough if you make careless mistakes." At the time, young Sophia had interpreted this to mean something very specific. Making mistakes means you're not actually smart. And if you're not smart, you have to work twice as hard as everyone else to prove you're worthy of being where you are. That one moment, that one sigh and sentence had somehow become the foundation of how she saw herself for the next 28 years. Standing in her kitchen, adult Sophia felt a chill run through her body. That belief that she wasn't naturally smart enough, that she had to constantly prove herself, that any mistake would reveal her inadequacy, had been running her life. It explained why she worked longer hours than anyone else on her team, why she checked her work obsessively, why she never felt satisfied with her accomplishments, and why the thought of a promotion, which would put her under even more scrutiny, felt not like a reward but like a threat. The following Monday, something unusual happened. Sophia's colleague Marcus stopped by her office during lunch. He was carrying a sandwich and looked slightly nervous. "Hey, can I talk to you about something?" he asked. Sophia nodded, motioning for him to sit down. Marcus took a bite of his sandwich and said, "I heard Richard offered you the senior director position." Sophia felt her defenses rise immediately, but Marcus continued before she could respond. "I want to tell you something. When I first started here 5 years ago, I was offered a promotion. After my first year, I turned it down because I was terrified. I didn't think I was ready. I thought I'd fail, and everyone would see that I didn't deserve to be there in the first place." Sophia's heart started beating faster. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Marcus smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I watched someone else take that position, someone who was less qualified than me, honestly. And you know what? They did fine. Not perfect, but fine. Meanwhile, I stayed in my lower position for another 2 years before they offered me a different promotion. I took it that time, but I always wondered what would have happened if I'd just said yes that first time, how much further along I'd be now." He looked directly at Sophia. "I see you doing the same thing I did, and I just wanted to say, you're ready. More than ready. The only thing holding you back is you." After Marcus left, Sophia sat in stunned silence. She pulled out that yellow sticky note from her drawer and read her questions again. Then she wrote a third question underneath. What would I do if I wasn't afraid? The answer came immediately, surprisingly clear. She would take the promotion. She would trust her 13 years of experience. She would believe that she'd earned this opportunity, not through luck, but through genuine skill and hard work. She would stop waiting to feel ready enough and just move forward. But knowing what she should do and actually doing it were two different things. That night, Sophia couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if she took the promotion and failed? What if her team lost respect for her? What if she made a major mistake that cost the company money? What if she proved once and for all that she really was a fraud? At 2 in the morning, she got out of bed and opened her laptop again. She started searching for information about overcoming limiting beliefs. She found a psychologist blog that outlined a process for identifying and challenging these internal rules. The psychologist explained that limiting beliefs persist because we never examine them. We accept them as facts rather than recognizing them as interpretations, and interpretations can be questioned. The blog suggested a simple exercise. Write down the limiting belief, then list all the evidence against it. Sophia grabbed a notebook and wrote at the top, "I am not smart enough to succeed at higher levels." Then she forced herself to list evidence against this belief. She wrote, "I graduated with honors from a competitive university. I've consistently exceeded performance targets for 13 years. I've led successful campaigns that generated millions in revenue. My team respects me and seeks my guidance. Industry leaders have recognized my work. I've solved complex problems that others couldn't figure out. Clients specifically request to work with me." As she wrote, something shifted inside her when she looked at this list, actual facts about her career. The belief that she wasn't smart enough suddenly seemed absurd. How could all of these things be true if she wasn't intelligent and capable? They couldn't, which meant the belief wasn't a fact. It was a story she'd been telling herself, a story that began with a 7-year-old's interpretation of her father's sigh. But recognizing that a belief is false doesn't automatically make it disappear. Sophia had carried this belief for so long that it had become part of her identity. Changing it would require more than just logical reasoning. It would require her to act differently, even when acting differently felt uncomfortable and scary. The next morning, Sophia did something she'd never done before. She arrived at work, walked straight to Richard's office, and asked if they could talk. When Richard invited her in, she sat down, took a deep breath, and said, "I want to accept the senior director position." Richard's face broke into a huge smile. "Sophia, that's fantastic. I'm so glad you've decided, but I need to be honest with you," Sophia interrupted. "I'm terrified. I don't feel ready. Part of me is convinced I'm going to fail spectacularly. I'm saying yes anyway, because I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions." Richard's smile softened into something more understanding. He leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I tell you something? When they offered me the VP position 7 years ago, I almost turned it down. I thought I wasn't ready either. I even told my wife I was going to say no. She asked me, 'Are you not ready, or are you just scared?' That question changed everything." He continued, "Sophia, nobody feels completely ready for the next level. If you feel ready, the position probably isn't challenging enough. The fact that you're scared means you're pushing yourself into new territory. That's exactly where growth happens." What Richard said next would stay with Sophia forever. The difference between people who advance and people who stay stuck isn't confidence It's the willingness to act, despite uncertainty. Confident people and scared people feel the same thing when facing a challenge. The only difference is that confident people have practiced acting anyway. That afternoon, Sophia's promotion was announced to the company. Messages of congratulations flooded her inbox. Her team took her out for celebratory drinks after work. On the surface, it should have been a perfect day, but Sophia still felt anxious. The negative voice in her head was still there, still whispering that she'd made a mistake, that she'd regret this decision. She realized then that accepting the promotion was just the first step. The real work would be learning to function in her new role. While that voice of doubt kept talking, she couldn't wait until the voice went silent to move forward with her life. She had to learn to move forward with the voice still there. Over the next few weeks, Sophia started her transition into the new role. There were moments when her old limiting beliefs screamed at her. During her first executive meeting, she felt like everyone could see through her. When she had to give critical feedback to a team member twice her age, she was certain she sounded like a fraud. When her first major campaign proposal was questioned by the CEO, she wanted to crawl under the table. But something interesting started happening. Each time she felt that surge of imposter syndrome, she would pause, acknowledge the feeling, and then ask herself, what would I do if I trusted myself? Then she would do that thing. She'd speak up in the meeting, even though her voice shook. She'd deliver the feedback kindly but directly. She'd defend her proposal with data and rationale instead of apologizing, and nothing terrible happened. The executives didn't laugh at her contributions. The team member appreciated the honest feedback. The CEO approved her campaign after she addressed his concerns. Slowly, through repeated experiences of acting, despite fear, Sophia began to accumulate evidence that contradicted her limiting beliefs. One evening, about 2 months into her new role, Sophia was working late finishing up a presentation. Her team had already gone home. As she saved her final slide, she noticed the yellow sticky note still tucked in her desk drawer. She pulled it out and looked at her 3 questions. Why am I so afraid? What am I really afraid of? What would I do if I wasn't afraid? She grabbed a pen and wrote one final note. I am enough, exactly as I am. As she wrote those words, something unexpected happened. She started crying again, but this time it was different. These weren't tears of recognition or sadness. They were tears of relief. Relief that she could finally stop trying so hard to prove something that had never needed proving. Relief that she could make mistakes without her entire sense of self crumbling. Relief that she could be imperfect and still be worthy. Sophia's story could end here, with her overcoming her limiting beliefs and succeeding in her new role. But real transformation doesn't work that cleanly, because 3 months into the position, Sophia made her first significant mistake. She had approved a marketing campaign that performed poorly. The client was unhappy, the company lost money, and in the post-mortem meeting, Sophia had to stand up and take responsibility for the decision. As she sat in that conference room, explaining what went wrong and how they would prevent similar mistakes in the future, she felt every old belief come roaring back. See, the voice in her head said, you're not smart enough for this. You've been found out. Everyone knows you're a fraud now. But then Richard said something that cut through the noise. Sophia, thank you for owning this. The measure of a leader isn't whether they make mistakes. It's how they handle mistakes when they happen. This is how you learn. This is how you get better. Later that day, Marcus stopped by her office again. I heard about the campaign, he said. How are you doing? Sophia was surprised to find herself smiling.
Honestly,
I'm okay. I feel bad about the mistake. And we're fixing it, but I don't feel like it defines me. I'm not spiraling like I would have before. I just feel like I'm a person who made a mistake, not a person who is a mistake. Does that make sense? Marcus nodded. That's the difference. That's growth right there. As the months passed, Sophia continued to notice patterns in her thinking. She realized that limiting beliefs don't disappear entirely. They just lose their power over time. The voice of doubt was still there, but it got quieter, and more importantly, she got better at recognizing it as just a voice, not the truth. She started noticing limiting beliefs in other areas of her life too. She'd always told herself she was not athletic, so she never tried sports or physical activities. One day, a friend invited her to a beginner's rock climbing class. Sophia's first instinct was to say, "No, I'm not athletic, remember." But then she caught herself. That was another limiting belief, formed when she was picked last for kickball in 4th grade. She went to the climbing class. She wasn't naturally gifted at it, but she enjoyed it. More importantly, she proved to herself that not athletic was just another story, not a fact. Within a few months, she was climbing twice a week and felt stronger and more capable in her body than she ever had before. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was quiet and gradual, but it was real. 6 months into her new position, Sophia was asked to speak at an industry conference. The old Sophia would have immediately said no. Public speaking was terrifying, and what if she embarrassed herself in front of hundreds of people? But the new Sophia, the one who was learning to question her limiting beliefs, said yes. The night before her talk, she was nervous. No, she was terrified. She couldn't eat dinner. She kept checking and rechecking her slides. She barely slept. But when she walked onto that stage, the next morning, something clicked. She realized that being nervous didn't mean she couldn't do this. Fear and capability could exist at the same time. Her talk was about creative marketing strategies in the digital age. She shared case studies from her work, offered practical advice, and even admitted to the audience that she'd made mistakes along the way. When she finished, the applause felt surreal. During the Q&A session, person after person told her how helpful her insights were. One young woman approached her afterward and said, "I really appreciated that you talked about making mistakes. Everyone else acts like they have it all figured out. You made me feel like it's okay to be still learning." Sophia smiled and said, "We're all still learning." The people who pretend they have it all figured out are just better at hiding their doubts. That evening, sitting alone in her hotel room, Sophia reflected on how far she'd come. A year ago, she was turning down promotions because she didn't believe she deserved them. Now she was speaking at conferences and mentoring others. The difference wasn't that she'd suddenly become more talented or capable. She'd always had those qualities. The difference was that she'd stopped believing the story that said she wasn't enough. But Sophia's journey also taught her something else important. Overcoming limiting beliefs isn't a one-time achievement, it's an ongoing practice. Even now, she sometimes catches herself falling into old patterns of thinking. The difference is that she recognizes them faster and challenges them sooner. One day, about a year into her role as senior director, Sophia's team was celebrating the launch of a particularly successful campaign. Everyone was in high spirits, congratulating each other and sharing credit. In the middle of the celebration, Sophia had a strange moment of clarity. She realized she was genuinely enjoying this moment without the nagging voice telling her she didn't deserve it. She wasn't worried about what could go wrong next or how she might fail in the future. She was just present, appreciating the success she and her team had created. That night, she called her parents. Her father answered the phone. They chatted about regular things, weather, family news, the usual. Then Sophia said something she'd never said before. "Dad, I want to tell you something. Remember when I was a kid and you'd check my homework?" Her father chuckled. "Oh boy, I probably wasn't the most patient about that, was I? Actually, I wanted to talk about something specific. I was thinking about this time when I got a math problem wrong, and you said I needed to work harder because smart wasn't enough. If I made careless mistake." There was a pause. I said to that, "Yeah. And I've been thinking about it because I realized I carried that with me for a really long time. I interpreted it to mean that I wasn't actually smart, that I had to constantly prove myself. It turned into this belief that if I made mistakes, it meant I wasn't good enough." Her father was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "Sophia, honey, I am so sorry. I had no idea that one comment would stick with you like that. I was probably stressed about work or something and wasn't thinking about how my words would land. You were always smart, brilliantly smart. I was so proud of you." Sophia felt tears forming. "I know that now, Dad. I'm not calling to make you feel bad. I just wanted to tell you because I'm working on letting go of beliefs that don't serve me anymore. And I realized that belief came from that moment, but it wasn't true then, and it's not true now." Her father sighed, a very different sigh than the one from her childhood. "You know, I probably had my own limiting beliefs that I was passing down without realizing it. My father was incredibly critical, and I swore I'd never be like that with my kids. But I guess some of it leaked through anyway. I'm really proud of you for working through this stuff, honey. That takes real courage." After they hung up, Sophia felt lighter than she had in years. She realized that limiting beliefs don't just affect us individually. They often get passed down through families, through cultures, through generations. Breaking free from them isn't just personal healing, it's breaking a cycle. The following week, Sophia started a new practice at work. During team meetings, she began asking her direct reports about their career goals and what was holding them back from pursuing them. She was surprised by how many of them shared their own limiting beliefs. "I'm not leadership material. I'm not creative enough for that role. I'm too introverted to lead a team." As she listened to each person, she recognized the same pattern she'd experienced. Smart, capable people holding themselves back because of stories they believed about themselves. She started gently challenging these beliefs, not by telling people they were wrong, but by asking questions that helped them examine the evidence. To the person who said they weren't creative enough. Can you tell me about that campaign idea you pitched last month? Because that was one of the most creative solutions to a problem I've seen in a while. To the person who said they were too introverted. Some of the best leaders I know are introverts. They listen more than they talk, and their teams feel heard. Have you considered that your introversion might actually be a strength in leadership, not a weakness? Slowly, she watched her team members start to question their own limiting beliefs. Some of them began taking on challenges they'd previously avoided. One woman who'd insisted she was bad with numbers volunteered to lead a data analysis project and discovered she actually enjoyed working with analytics when she wasn't telling herself she couldn't do it. Sophia realized that creating a culture where limiting beliefs could be acknowledged and challenged was just as important as individual transformation. When people felt safe admitting their doubts and fears, they could work through them together instead of suffering in silence. About 18 months into her role, Richard approached Sophia with another opportunity. The company was expanding internationally, and they needed someone to lead the European division's marketing strategy. It would mean relocating to London for at least 2 years, possibly longer. It was a massive career move, prestigious, challenging, and slightly terrifying. Sophia's immediate internal response was interesting. Instead of an overwhelming wave of "I can't do this," she felt a mixture of excitement and realistic concern. She thought, this would be really hard. I'd be leaving my comfort zone, my friends, my established life, and I don't know if I'd be successful, but I'm curious about trying. That night she made a list of all the reasons this opportunity scared her. Then she made another list of all the reasons she might actually thrive in this role. When she looked at both lists side by side, she realized something important. Her fears were mostly about uncertainty and potential discomfort, not about actual inability. She asked herself the question that had become her touchstone. What would I do if I trusted myself? The answer was clear. She would say yes. When Sophia accepted the London position, something interesting happened. Instead of feeling anxious about whether she'd made the right choice, she felt proud that she'd grown into someone who could say yes to opportunities even when they were scary. Proud that she'd learned to distinguish between limiting beliefs and legitimate concerns. Proud that she was still pushing herself to grow instead of settling into comfortable patterns. During her last week in Chicago, Sophia took Marcus out for coffee to thank him for the conversation that had started her transformation. "You probably don't remember," she said, "but about 2 years ago, you came to my office and told me about turning down a promotion. That conversation changed my life." Marcus smiled. "I remember, and I've watched you change since then. You carry yourself differently now. You seem lighter somehow." "I feel lighter," Sophia admitted. "I'm not dragging around all these beliefs about not being good enough anymore. Or, I should say, the beliefs are still there sometimes, but they don't run my life. I can recognize them as old fears, not current reality." "What advice would you give to someone who's where you were 2 years ago?" Marcus asked. Sophia thought about this carefully. "I'd say, start by noticing. Just notice when that critical voice in your head says you can't do something. Don't try to change it right away. Just notice it. Then get curious about where that belief came from. Is it actually true, or is it a story you've been telling yourself? And finally, practice acting as if the belief weren't true, not because you feel confident, but as an experiment. See what happens when you try the thing you think you can't do. She paused, then added, and be patient with yourself. This isn't about becoming a different person overnight. It's about slowly becoming more yourself, the person you would be without all those false limitations. As Sophia boarded her plane to London, a few weeks later, she found herself thinking about that crumpled yellow note, the one that had started everything with just 5 words. Why am I so afraid? She'd kept that note, and it was now tucked into a journal, which was packed in her carry-on bag. Looking out the airplane window as Chicago grew smaller below her, Sophia realized that fear hadn't disappeared from her life. If anything, she was facing bigger fears now than ever before, but the relationship with fear had changed. It was no longer her master dictating what she could and couldn't do. It was more like an indicator light on a dashboard, useful information about stepping outside her comfort zone, but not a command to stop. The first few months in London were challenging in ways Sophia hadn't anticipated. The cultural differences were subtle but real. Building a new team from scratch required different skills than managing an existing team. The business landscape in Europe operated by different rules than what she was used to in the States. There were days when she questioned her decision to take this role, but she'd learned something crucial. Questioning a decision doesn't mean you've made the wrong choice. Sometimes uncertainty is just part of the process of doing something new and difficult. Instead of spiraling into self-doubt when things got hard, Sophia got curious. What could she learn from this challenge? Who could she ask for help? How could she approach this problem differently? One particularly difficult day, about 4 months into her London tenure, Sophia's team was struggling with a campaign that wasn't performing. The client was unhappy, her boss was concerned, and Sophia felt the old familiar panic rising. For a moment, all the old limiting beliefs came flooding back. See, you weren't ready for this. You're in over your head. Everyone's going to realize you don't belong here. But this time, Sophia recognized what was happening. She was in a challenging situation. Yes, but her fear wasn't proportional to the actual problem. It was magnified by old beliefs trying to reassert themselves. She took a breath and asked herself a different question. What would an effective leader do in this situation? An effective leader would stay calm, gather information, work with the team to troubleshoot, and develop a recovery plan. So that's what Sophia did. She didn't wait until she felt confident. She acted like a leader, even while feeling uncertain. The campaign issue got resolved. It took work, some creative problem solving, and collaboration across departments, but they turned it around. More importantly, Sophia noticed that she recovered from the stress of that situation much faster than she would have in the past. The challenge didn't send her into a spiral of self-doubt that lasted for weeks. It was just a problem that needed solving, not evidence of her inadequacy. As her first year in London came to a close, Sophia was asked to present the European Division's annual results to the company's global leadership team. The presentation would be attended by the CEO, the board of directors, and executives from all over the world. It was the kind of high-stakes moment that would have paralyzed the old Sophia. The night before the presentation, She video called her friend Marcus back in Chicago. I'm nervous, she admitted. This is a huge deal. What if I mess up in front of all these important people? Marcus laughed gently. Sophia, do you remember what you were like when I first talked to you about the promotion? You were turning down opportunities because you were convinced you'd fail. Now you're presenting to the CEO in a foreign country. The fact that you're nervous just means you care about doing well. That's not a bad thing. You're right, Sophia said. I guess I sometimes forget how far I've come. That's because growth happens gradually. But trust me, the change is dramatic. You're not the same person who was too scared to accept a promotion. You've proven that to yourself over and over again. The presentation went well. Sophia was nervous, but she channeled that nervous energy into preparation and enthusiasm. She delivered her points clearly, handled questions confidently, and even injected some humor when appropriate. Afterward, the CEO pulled her aside and said, "Strong work, Sophia. The board is impressed with what you've built over there." But the most meaningful moment came from a younger woman on her team who'd attended the presentation. She approached Sophia afterward and said quietly, "Can I ask you something? You seemed so confident up there. Do you ever doubt yourself?" Sophia smiled. "All the time. I was nervous as hell during that whole presentation." The woman looked surprised. "Really? You didn't show it at all." "That's because confidence isn't about not feeling doubt or fear. It's about not letting those feelings stop you from doing what you need to do. I've learned that I can be scared and capable at the same time. Those aren't opposites, they can exist together." The woman nodded slowly. That actually helps a lot. I've been holding myself back from some opportunities because I didn't feel confident enough. But maybe I've been thinking about confidence wrong. Probably, Sophia said kindly. Most of us are. We wait to feel ready before we try new things. But readiness comes from trying, not the other way around. This conversation reminded Sophia of why challenging limiting beliefs mattered not just for personal success, but for creating a ripple effect. When one person breaks free from self-imposed limitations, they give permission to others to do the same. Leadership isn't just about business results, it's about modeling what's possible. As Sophia's second year in London progressed, she found herself becoming a mentor to several people in the organization. Young professionals, especially women, sought her advice about navigating their careers. The most common theme in these conversations was some variation of imposter syndrome or limiting beliefs. She heard the same patterns again and again. I'm not experienced enough. I'm not confident enough. I don't have the right background. I'm not sure I belong here. Each time, Sophia would share parts of her own story, not to position herself as someone who'd figured it all out, but as someone who was still working through these same challenges. One of her mentees, a brilliant young analyst named Priya, was particularly stuck. She had turned down 2 internal transfer opportunities because she didn't feel ready enough. During one of their monthly coffee meetings, Priya confessed, "I just feel like everyone else knows what they're doing, and I'm constantly scrambling to keep up." "How did you get past that feeling?" Sophia was quiet for a moment, then said, "Honestly, I didn't get past it completely. I still have moments where I feel that way, but I've learned to recognize it as a feeling, not a fact. Can I tell you something? Every single person you think has it all figured out is also scrambling sometimes. They're just better at hiding it. Really? Priya looks skeptical. Really? The difference between people who advance and people who stay stuck isn't that some people don't have doubts. It's that some people act despite their doubts. They've learned that you don't wait until you feel ready. You become ready by doing the thing that scares you. Priya nodded slowly. So when the next opportunity comes up, I should just say yes, even if I'm terrified. Not quite, Sophia clarified. You should ask yourself whether your fear is based on a real limitation or a limiting belief. If you genuinely don't have skills or experience necessary for a role, that's different. But if you have the skills and you're just scared of failing or being exposed as a fraud, that's a limiting belief. And limiting beliefs should never make your decisions. This distinction was important, something Sophia had learned through her own journey. Not all fear is irrational. Sometimes caution is wise. The key is learning to tell the difference between legitimate concern and self-imposed limitation. Over time, Sophia developed a framework she called the reality check questions that she shared with her mentees. 1. What evidence do I have that this belief is true? 2. What evidence do I have that contradicts this belief? 3. Would I judge someone else by this standard? 4. What's the worst that could realistically happen if I'm wrong? 5. What opportunity cost am I paying by believing this? These questions helped people move from emotional reaction to logical evaluation. Because limiting beliefs feel true, they trigger real fear and anxiety. But feelings aren't facts, and learning to examine our beliefs critically is essential for growth. As Sophia approached her 3rd year in London, the company offered her yet another opportunity. Chief Marketing Officer for the entire global organization, based back in New York. This would make her the youngest person ever to hold this position in the company's history. It was everything she'd once dreamed of achieving. Her first reaction was interesting, excitement mixed with imposter syndrome. Am I really qualified for this? What if I fail at such a visible level? What will people think? But then she caught herself and smiled. These were familiar old patterns, like running into an old acquaintance. She acknowledged them. Oh, hello again, fear of inadequacy, and then set them aside to focus on the actual decision. She made lists. She talked to trusted mentors. She honestly assessed whether she had the skills and experience needed for the role, and she realized something profound. She was as qualified as anyone could be for a position they'd never held before. Nobody is completely prepared for their first CMO role because you can't fully prepare for something you haven't experienced. The question wasn't whether she was perfectly ready. It was whether she was capable of learning and growing into the role. She said yes. When news of Sophia's appointment as CMO spread through the company, she received hundreds of messages of congratulations. But one message stood out. It was from a woman named Jennifer, who'd attended Sophia's conference talk almost 3 years earlier, the talk where Sophia had admitted to making mistakes and still learning. Jennifer wrote, I wanted you to know that your talk changed my career trajectory. I was about to leave marketing entirely because I felt like I wasn't cut out for it. But hearing you talk about your own doubts and struggles made me realize I wasn't uniquely inadequate. I was just human. I stuck with it, worked on my limiting beliefs, and last month I was promoted to director. Thank you for being honest about the messy reality of growth. Reading that message, Sophia felt overwhelmed with gratitude, not just for her own journey, but for the opportunity to influence others' journeys. This was the real impact of doing the inner work to challenge limiting beliefs. It didn't just change your own life, it gave others permission to change theirs too. In her first weeks as CMO, Sophia faced the predictable challenges of stepping into a major leadership role. There were politics to navigate, stakeholders to manage, and enormous pressure to deliver results. The old limiting beliefs tried to resurface. You're not qualified for this. You're going to fail. Everyone will see you were a bad choice. But now, Sophia had years of practice in recognizing and challenging these thoughts. She'd built what psychologists call psychological flexibility, the ability to be aware of difficult thoughts and feelings without being controlled by them. She could notice the fear without letting it dictate her actions. More importantly, she'd learned something crucial about limiting beliefs. They don't disappear entirely, but they lose their power. It's like the difference between being controlled by waves and learning to surf them. The waves are still there, but you're no longer drowning in them. 6 months into her role as CMO, Sophia was invited to speak at a women's leadership conference. The organizers asked her to talk about her career journey and what had enabled her success. As she prepared her talk, Sophia found herself thinking about that crumpled yellow note from years ago, the one that had started everything. She began her talk by telling the audience about turning down 3 promotions because she didn't believe she deserved them. She talked about the limiting beliefs that had held her back, the belief that she wasn't smart enough, that she was lucky rather than capable, that any success was temporary, and any mistake would expose her as a fraud. Then she shared the questions that had changed everything. Why am I so afraid? What am I really afraid of? What would I do if I wasn't afraid? But she didn't frame her story as one of overcoming fear and achieving perfect confidence. Instead, she told the truth. I'm still afraid sometimes. I still doubt myself. I'm still learning. The difference is that fear no longer has the final say. I've learned to act with fear, not in spite of it. I've learned that courage isn't the absence of doubt. It's the decision to move forward anyway. She ended her talk by asking the audience to consider their own limiting beliefs. What story are you telling yourself about what you can't do or who you can't be? And more importantly, is that story actually true? Or is it just a belief you've never questioned? Because the only difference between the person you are and the person you could be is the stories you're willing to let go of. The response was overwhelming. During the Q&A session, person after person shared their own limiting beliefs and asked for advice on how to change them. One woman said, I'm in my 50s, and I've been telling myself I'm too old to make a career change. But hearing your story makes me wonder if I've just been afraid to try. Sophia responded, You're not too old. You're just at a different stage. Every age comes with different advantages and challenges. The question isn't whether you're the right age. It's whether you're willing to question the belief that age defines what's possible for you. After the conference, Sophia received an email from the event organizer. They had surveyed attendees about the impact of different talks, and Sophia's session had the highest ratings. But what struck her most was the open-ended feedback. Multiple people had written variations of the same theme. This was the first time I heard a successful leader admit they still struggle with doubt. It made me realize I'm not broken, I'm just human. This realization crystallized something important for Sophia. The cultural narrative around success often implies that successful people have figured everything out, that they're confident and certain about their abilities. But this narrative actually perpetuates limiting beliefs because it makes everyone else feel inadequate by comparison. When we pretend we have it all together, we make it harder for others to admit they're struggling. Real leadership, Sophia came to believe, isn't about projecting invulnerability. It's about being honest about the challenges, while demonstrating that those challenges don't have to stop you. It's about showing that you can be uncertain and still make decisions, scared and still move forward, imperfect and still worthy. As her first year as CMO progressed, Sophia made it a priority to create a culture where limiting beliefs could be openly discussed and challenged. She started team meetings with a practice she called fear check-ins, where people could optionally share something they were nervous about or doubting themselves on. The practice normalized vulnerability and created space for collective problem solving. At first, people were hesitant. Admitting fear or doubt in a professional setting felt risky. But when Sophia consistently modeled vulnerability herself, sharing her own concerns about upcoming presentations or strategic decisions, others began to open up. The marketing department developed a reputation as a place where people could be both ambitious and honest about their struggles. One of the most powerful moments came during a strategy retreat. Sophia's direct report, a talented director named Ahmed, admitted he'd been considering leaving the company because he didn't think he had what it took to advance to VP level. I look at the executives, he said, and they seem so confident and put together. I'm not like that. I second-guess myself constantly. I figured that meant I wasn't leadership material. Another director, Lisa, immediately responded, Ahmed, I think about quitting at least once a month, because I'm convinced everyone's going to figure out I don't know what I'm doing. I've been faking confidence for so long, I've forgotten what real confidence even feels like. As more people shared similar experiences, Ahmed looked stunned. Wait, you all feel this way? I thought it was just me. Sophia smiled. That's exactly the point. We all struggle with these doubts. The difference between people who advance and people who quit isn't confidence. It's the willingness to keep going despite the doubt. Ahmed, you absolutely have what it takes to be a VP. Your self-doubt isn't evidence that you don't belong at that level. It's just evidence that you're human. That conversation led to a broader initiative. Sophia championed company-wide training on recognizing and challenging limiting beliefs. She brought in organizational psychologists to help people identify the unconscious beliefs that were holding them back, both individually and as a culture. The results were remarkable. Employee engagement scores went up. More people applied for stretch assignments and promotions. The pipeline of diverse talent advancing into leadership positions expanded, and perhaps most importantly, people reported feeling more authentic and less stressed at work because they weren't constantly trying to hide their doubts or maintain a facade of perfect confidence. 2 years into her role as CMO, Sophia was asked to join the company's board of directors. It was an honor that came with significant responsibility, oversight of company strategy, fiduciary duty to shareholders, and influence over the organization's direction. Once again, that familiar voice of doubt whispered, "Are you sure you're qualified for this? What if you make a bad decision that impacts thousands of people?" But by now, Sophia had a well-developed practice for handling these moments. She would pause, acknowledge the fear, and then ask, "Is this fear protecting me from real danger? Or is it just an old pattern trying to keep me small?" In this case, she recognized it as the latter. She had the experience, expertise, and judgment needed to serve on the board. The fear was just her limiting beliefs, making one last attempt to hold her back. She accepted the board position, looking back on her journey from the woman who turned down 3 promotions to a C-suite executive and board member. Sophia could see the transformation clearly, but it wasn't a straight line from fear to confidence. It was a gradual process of learning to recognize limiting beliefs, question their validity, and act despite uncertainty. The most important lesson she'd learned was this: you don't have to wait till you feel confident to take action. You don't have to eliminate fear before pursuing your goals. You don't have to be perfect before you're worthy. These are all lies that limiting beliefs tell us to keep us stuck. The truth is simpler and harder. Growth happens in the space between comfort and capability. It happens when you do the thing you think you can't do and survive. It happens when you try and fail and realize that failure isn't fatal. It happens when you catch yourself believing an old story and choose to write a new one instead. One evening, about 3 years after that first yellow sticky note, Sophia was cleaning out her desk and found the note tucked into an old journal. She read her questions again. Why am I so afraid? What am I really afraid of? What would I do if I wasn't afraid? She smiled and pulled out a pen. Underneath those 3 questions, she wrote one more. Who would I be if I trusted myself? Then she wrote her answer. I'd be exactly who I am now, still learning, still growing, still imperfect, but no longer limited by stories that were never true in the first place. Sophia kept that note, but not as a reminder of how far she'd come. She kept it as a reminder that the work of challenging limiting beliefs is never finished. There will always be new situations that trigger old doubts. There will always be opportunities that feel too big or too scary. The difference is that now she knows the size of the opportunity doesn't determine whether you're capable of rising to it. Your willingness to try, despite uncertainty, does. Years later, when people would ask Sophia about the turning point in her career, she would think back to that crumpled yellow note. But the real story was more complex than a single moment of revelation. It was thousands of small decisions, each one chipping away at the fortress of limiting beliefs she'd built around herself over 3 decades. What most people didn't see were the countless moments when Sophia almost quit. The times when the voice of doubt was so loud that moving forward felt impossible. The nights when she lay awake, convinced she'd made a terrible mistake. The meetings where she had to fight the urge to apologize for taking up space. These moments didn't make it into her conference talks or her LinkedIn posts, but they were just as much a part of her transformation as the successes. About 4 years into her journey of challenging limiting beliefs, Sophia faced what would become her greatest test. The company was going through a major restructuring. Market conditions had changed dramatically, and difficult decisions needed to be made. As CMO, Sophia was responsible for cutting her department's budget by 30%, which meant letting go of 15 people from her team. The night before, she had to announce the layoffs. Sophia sat in her office long after everyone else had gone home. She felt physically sick. These weren't just employees. They were people she'd mentored, people who'd trusted her leadership, people with families and mortgages and dreams, and she was about to upend their lives. The old limiting beliefs came back with a vengeance. You're not cut out for this level of leadership. Making these kinds of decisions requires a ruthlessness you don't have. You're going to fail these people. But underneath those familiar fears was something new. A recognition that this wasn't about her adequacy. This was about a genuinely difficult situation that would be hard for anyone. She called her old colleague Marcus, who'd since become a close friend and trusted advisor. I don't know if I can do this, she told him. I keep thinking maybe someone else would be better at making these calls. Someone who doesn't feel so conflicted about it. Marcus was quiet for a moment before responding. Sophia, you know what would worry me? If you weren't conflicted, if you could make these decisions without feeling the weight of them. The fact that this is hard for you means you understand what's at stake. That makes you exactly the right person to handle it with care and dignity. But what if I make the wrong choices? What if I cut the wrong positions or keep the wrong people? Then you'll deal with the consequences and make adjustments. But here's what I know. You'll make these decisions thoughtfully. You'll consider the impact on people's lives. You'll do everything you can to support the people who have to leave. That's what ethical leadership looks like. It's not about having perfect confidence in every decision. It's about doing your best with imperfect information and taking responsibility for the outcomes. The next day, Sophia delivered the news to her team. She didn't hide behind corporate language or try to minimize the reality of what was happening. She was direct about the business situation, transparent about how decisions were made, and genuinely emotional when talking about the people who would be leaving. Afterward, one of the employees, who was being let go, approached her. Sophia braced herself for anger or accusations. Instead, the woman said, "Thank you for treating us like human beings. I've been through layoffs before, where leadership acted like we were just numbers on a spreadsheet. You made this awful situation a little less awful by being honest and compassionate." This experience taught Sophia something crucial about limiting beliefs. Sometimes they protect us from confronting difficult truths about leadership and responsibility. It's easier to believe I'm not capable of this than to accept I am capable of this, and that means I have to make hard choices that will hurt people. Growth isn't just about taking on bigger opportunities. It's about accepting the full weight of those opportunities, including the difficult parts. In the months following the restructuring, Sophia noticed something interesting. Her team, now smaller but more focused, seemed to work with greater cohesion and purpose. The people who'd been let go mostly landed on their feet, several in positions that ended up being better fits for their skills and interests. The situation that had seemed catastrophic ended up being manageable, though still painful. But the bigger lesson was about the relationship between limiting beliefs and avoidance. Sophia realized that for years she'd unconsciously avoided situations that might trigger her deepest fears. She'd turned down promotions not just because she doubted herself, but because accepting them would mean facing exactly the kind of difficult leadership moments she'd just experienced. Her limiting beliefs had been a form of protection. If you never put yourself in challenging positions, you never have to risk failing in visible ways. The problem with this protective strategy was that it also prevented growth. Safety and growth are often at odds with each other. You can't expand your capabilities while staying in your comfort zone. This realization helped Sophia understand why challenging limiting beliefs felt so threatening. It wasn't just about changing thoughts. It was about being willing to be uncomfortable, uncertain, and vulnerable. Around this time, Sophia started working with an executive coach named Dr. Patricia Chen. Patricia specialized in helping high-achieving professionals overcome the psychological barriers that limited their effectiveness. In their first session, Patricia asked Sophia to describe her biggest challenge. Sophia expected to talk about business strategy or team management. Instead, she found herself talking about the persistent sense that she didn't fully belong at the executive level. Interesting, Patricia said. Tell me more about this feeling of not belonging. When do you notice it most? Sophia thought about it. In board meetings, mostly. Everyone else seems so certain about their opinions. They speak with this authority, like they just know they're right. I'm always second-guessing myself, wondering if my perspective is valid. And what do you do with that second-guessing? Usually, I hold back. I wait to speak until I'm absolutely sure I have something valuable to add, which sometimes means I don't speak at all. Patricia nodded. So the limiting belief, I don't belong here, leads to behavioral patterns that actually reinforce the belief. You hold back, you don't contribute as much, and then you have even more evidence that you're not operating at the same level as everyone else. Does that sound right? Sophia felt like something clicked into place. Yes, exactly that. Here's what I want you to consider. Patricia continued. What if everyone in those board meetings is also second-guessing themselves? What if the appearance of certainty is just that, an appearance, synonym of thinking, I need to sound confident, even though I'm not totally sure, while you're thinking, I can't speak because I'm not totally sure. Same internal experience, different behavioral response. This perspective was revolutionary for Sophia. She'd always assumed that confident people felt differently than she did, that they had some internal sense of certainty that she lacked. The possibility that they felt the same doubts, but had simply learned different coping strategies, changed everything. So how do I learn to speak up, even when I'm not completely certain? Sophia asked. By practicing, Patricia said simply. In our next board meeting, I want you to try something. Speak up within the first 10 minutes, even if you're not 100% confident about your point. Start by saying something like, here's my thinking on this, or one perspective to consider. You're not claiming to have the absolute truth. You're contributing a viewpoint. See what happens. The next board meeting felt like a personal experiment. 8 minutes in, during a discussion about market expansion strategy, Sophia raised her hand. Her heart was pounding. Here's my thinking on this, she began, using Patricia's exact phrase. We're looking at expansion into Southeast Asian markets, but I'm wondering if we're underestimating the localization challenges. In my experience with the European expansion, cultural adaptation took twice as long as we anticipated. Should we factor that into our timeline? The CEO nodded thoughtfully. That's a really good point, Sophia. We probably are being too optimistic about the timeline. Let's adjust the projections. Then he moved on to the next agenda item. That was it. No dramatic reaction. No one challenged her credibility. Her contribution was simply acknowledged and incorporated. Sophia sat back in her chair, stunned by how anticlimactic it was. She'd built up speaking in board meetings as this huge risky thing, but the reality was much more ordinary. She'd offered a perspective based on her experience, and it had been valued, simple as that. Over the next several months, Sophia worked with Patricia to identify other areas where limiting beliefs were creating behavioral patterns that held her back. She discovered she had a tendency to over-prepare for presentations, spending hours perfecting slides that were already good enough because she believed that only perfect work would prove her competence. Patricia helped her see that this perfectionism was actually counterproductive, consuming time and energy that could be better spent on strategic thinking. Perfectionism isn't about high standards, Patricia explained during one of their sessions. It's about fear. It's a way of trying to protect yourself from criticism or failure. But here's the paradox. The more perfect you try to make something, the more attached you become to it, and the more devastating any criticism feels. Sophia recognized this pattern immediately. She would spend hours on a presentation, then feel personally wounded if anyone suggested changes or improvements. The problem wasn't the criticism itself, it was that she'd invested her sense of self-worth into the work. If the work wasn't perfect, then she wasn't good enough. So what's the alternative? Sophia asked. Just accept mediocrity? Patricia smiled. Not at all. The alternative is to have high standards without attaching your self-worth to the outcome. You do excellent work because excellent work serves your goals, not because your value as a person depends on it. When someone suggests an improvement, you can think, oh, good idea, that will make this better, instead of, oh no, they found a flaw, I'm not good enough. This distinction took time to internalize. Sophia started practicing by deliberately not over-preparing for lower-stakes meetings. She would create good enough slides and resist the urge to spend hours perfecting them. At first, this felt terrifying and irresponsible, but nothing bad happened. The presentations were fine, people engaged with the content, and Sophia had more time and energy for the strategic work that actually mattered. One breakthrough came during a quarterly business review. Sophia presented her department's results, and the CFO pointed out an error in one of her data slides. Old Sophia would have felt mortified, like this mistake revealed her fundamental inadequacy. New Sophia took a breath, acknowledged the error, said, "Thanks for catching that, I'll correct it for the final version," and moved on. The meeting continued. The error didn't define her presentation. Her competence wasn't called into question. It was just a mistake, nothing more. After the meeting, the CFO actually complimented her. "I appreciate how you handled that, Sophia. Too many executives get defensive when errors are pointed out. Your ability to acknowledge mistakes without getting rattled is a real strength." Sophia realized that what she'd always seen as a weakness, her tendency to notice and worry about her mistakes, could actually be reframed as a strength when approached differently. The key was acknowledging mistakes without letting them become evidence of inadequacy. It was the difference between I made a mistake, and I am a mistake. As Sophia continued working with Patricia, they began exploring the deeper roots of her limiting beliefs. One session in particular stood out. Patricia asked Sophia to close her eyes and think back to the earliest memory she had of feeling not good enough. Sophia immediately remembered being 7 years old, watching her father sigh over her math homework. But as she sat with that memory longer, something else surfaced. She was maybe 5 years old in kindergarten. The teacher had asked the class to draw their families. Sophia had drawn her parents and her older brother, but she'd drawn herself much smaller than everyone else. When the teacher asked her why, young Sophia had said, "Because I'm not as important as them." Sitting in Patricia's office, adult Sophia felt tears streaming down her face. She'd completely forgotten this memory, but now it felt significant. Where had that belief come from? Had someone told her she was less important, or had she observed something and drawn that conclusion on her own? What do you notice about that memory? Patricia asked gently. I made myself small, Sophia said. Literally drew myself as smaller. I've been doing that my whole life, making myself smaller, less important, less visible, not taking up space. And what would it mean to stop making yourself small? Sophia thought about this carefully. It would mean believing I have the same right to space, opportunity and recognition as anyone else. It would mean not apologizing for my existence or my needs. It would mean trusting that I'm valuable, not because of what I achieve or how perfectly I perform, but just because I'm a person. This was the core limiting belief underneath all the others. Not, I'm not smart enough, or I'm not capable enough, but I don't deserve to take up space in the world. Everything else, the turned down promotions, the perfectionism, the constant self-doubt, flowed from this fundamental belief about her worth. So how do I change that? Sophia asked. How do I stop believing something I've believed since I was 5 years old? Patricia leaned forward. You don't change it all at once. You change it through repeated experiences that contradict the belief. Every time you take up space, speak up in a meeting, negotiate for what you want, set a boundary, accept recognition without deflecting, you're creating evidence against that old belief. Over time, the weight of evidence shifts. The new belief becomes more credible than the old one. This made sense intellectually, but Sophia knew the emotional work would be harder. Beliefs formed in childhood have deep roots. They're not just thoughts, they're part of how we've learned to navigate the world and protect ourselves. Changing them requires not just logic, but courage to try new behaviors that feel foreign and risky. Over the following year, Sophia made a conscious practice of taking up space. When someone praised her work, instead of deflecting with, "Oh, it was nothing," or "the team did it all," she would simply say, "Thank you, I'm proud of how that turned out." When she had an idea in a meeting, she would share it without excessive preamble or apologies. When she needed something from a colleague, she would ask directly instead of hinting or making herself small. Each of these moments felt uncomfortable. There was always a voice saying, "You're being too much. You're going to annoy people. Who do you think you are?" But Sophia had learned to recognize this voice as the limiting belief trying to reassert control. she would acknowledge it. Hello again. Fear of taking up space, and then do the thing anyway. The results were surprising. When Sophia stopped making herself small, people didn't react negatively. If anything, they seemed to respect her more. When she spoke with confidence, people listened. When she negotiated for what she wanted, she usually got it. When she set clear boundaries about her time and energy, people respected them. The catastrophic outcome she'd feared never materialized. One particularly powerful moment came during salary negotiations. The CEO had offered Sophia a raise that, while generous, was below market rate for CMOs at similar companies. Old Sophia would have accepted it gratefully, just happy to be valued at all. New Sophia said, "I appreciate the offer, but I'd like to discuss the compensation further. Based on market data and the scope of my responsibilities, I believe the appropriate range is higher." The CEO looked surprised. Sophia had never pushed back on compensation before, but he said, "Fair enough. Send me the data you're looking at, and let's talk about it." They ended up negotiating a package that was significantly better than the initial offer. Afterward, the CEO actually thanked Sophia for advocating for herself. "I respect people who know their worth and aren't afraid to ask for it," he said. "It shows confidence and self-awareness." Sophia left that meeting with a profound realization. All these years, she'd been afraid that asserting her value would make people respect her less. But the opposite was true. Making herself small hadn't protected her, it had limited her. People respect those who respect themselves. This pattern repeated across different domains of her life. In her personal relationships, when Sophia started being more direct about her needs and boundaries, her friendships deepened rather than fracturing. When she stopped apologizing for being busy or having limits, people adjusted their expectations without resentment. When she shared her vulnerabilities without shame, people responded with empathy and reciprocal vulnerability. The most unexpected transformation happened in her relationship with her father. One holiday visit, her father made a comment about Sophia working too hard, suggesting she should slow down and enjoy life more. Normally, Sophia would have felt criticized and gotten defensive. Instead, she saw an opening. "Dad, can I tell you something?" she began. "For most of my life, I felt like I had to work twice as hard as everyone else to prove I was good enough, and I think that started with trying to earn your approval. I know you didn't mean it this way, but I interpreted your high expectations as meaning I was never quite adequate." Her father looked stricken. "Sophia, honey, I'm so sorry. I thought I was encouraging you to reach your potential. I had no idea you were experiencing it as criticism." "I know," Sophia said, "and I'm not blaming you. I'm telling you because I'm working on letting go of this belief that I have to earn my worth through achievement. And part of that process is being honest about where that belief came from." They talked for a long time that evening, really talked in a way they hadn't since Sophia was a child. Her father shared his own struggles with self-worth, how his father had been harshly critical, and how he tried so hard not to repeat those patterns with his own children. He'd thought he was being supportive and encouraging. He had no idea Sophia was interpreting his words through a lens of inadequacy. "You've always been enough, Sophia," her father said, tears in his eyes. "More than enough. I'm sorry I didn't say that more clearly when you were growing up. I'm proud of your accomplishments, but I'm even more proud of who you are as a person, your kindness, your integrity, your courage to grow and change. Hearing those words, Sophia felt something shift deep inside her. It was like a weight she'd been carrying for 30 years, suddenly lifted. She didn't need her father's approval to feel worthy. She'd learned that through years of challenging her limiting beliefs, but receiving it anyway, freely given, felt like coming home to a part of herself she'd lost as a child. As Sophia moved into her 5th year of actively challenging limiting beliefs, she noticed that the work was becoming less about specific beliefs and more about developing a different relationship with her thoughts altogether. She'd learned something that changed everything. Thoughts are not facts, and having a thought doesn't mean you have to believe it or act on it. This insight came during a meditation retreat that Patricia had recommended. Sophia had always dismissed meditation as not for her, another limiting belief, she realized, but she decided to try a weekend silent retreat at a meditation center outside the city. During one sitting meditation, Sophia's mind was full of anxious thoughts about work, projects she should be monitoring, emails she should answer, decisions she needed to make. The meditation teacher had instructed them to simply notice thoughts without engaging with them. Imagine your thoughts are like clouds passing across the sky, she'd said. You don't have to grab onto them or push them away. Just let them pass. As Sophia practiced this, something clicked. She realized she'd been treating her limiting beliefs as important information that required a response. I'm not good enough would arise, and she would either believe it and feel anxious, or fight it and try to prove it wrong. Either way, she was engaging with it as if it were true and significant. But what if limiting beliefs were just mental habits? Neural pathways that had been reinforced over time? What if she could notice the thought, I'm not good enough, the same way she'd noticed the thought, I should have oatmeal for breakfast, as just a mental event, not a profound truth about reality? This perspective was liberating. Sophia didn't have to defeat her limiting beliefs or make them go away completely. She just had to stop taking them so seriously. When the thought you're going to fail arose, she could acknowledge it. Oh, there's that thought again, and then redirect her attention to what she was actually doing. The meditation teacher called this practice diffusion, creating distance between yourself and your thoughts so they don't control your behavior. It wasn't about positive thinking or replacing negative thoughts with positive ones. It was about changing your relationship to thinking itself. Back at work, Sophia began applying this practice. During a high-stakes presentation to potential investors, the thought, they're going to see through you, arose. Instead of spiraling into anxiety or trying to convince herself otherwise, she simply noticed, having a fear thought right now. Then she redirected her attention to the content of her presentation and the people in the room. The thought was still there, but it was in the background rather than driving her behavior. This practice didn't make the thoughts go away, but it dramatically reduced their power. Sophia found she could function effectively, even when fear thoughts or self-doubt arose. She could give a presentation while thinking, this might not go well. She could make difficult decisions while thinking, I might be wrong. She could take risks while thinking, this is scary. The thoughts and the actions were separate. Around this time, Sophia was invited to give a TEDx talk about overcoming self-imposed limitations. The invitation triggered every limiting belief she'd worked on. You're not a good enough speaker. You don't have anything original to say. People will think you're self-promoting, but now she had tools for working with these. She practiced diffusion. I'm having the thought that I'm not a good speaker. Interesting. She gathered evidence. Actually, I've given dozens of presentations that were well received. She checked her values. Is sharing what I've learned important to me, regardless of how scared I feel? The answer was yes. She said yes to the TEDx talk. Preparing the talk was its own journey of challenging limiting beliefs. Sophia wrote and rewrote her script dozens of times, each time fighting the perfectionism that said it wasn't good enough yet. She practiced the talk until she could deliver it naturally, fighting the belief that she needed to memorize every word perfectly. She chose to be vulnerable and honest in the talk, fighting the belief that showing any weakness would undermine her credibility. The day of the talk, Sophia was terrified, backstage, waiting for her turn. She felt her heart racing and her hands shaking. All the old thoughts came flooding in. You're going to forget your words. You're going to stumble. Everyone will see how nervous you are. This was a huge mistake. But instead of fighting these thoughts, or trying to calm herself down, Sophia did something different. She acknowledged the fear. Yes, I'm scared. This is a big moment, and it matters to me. Of course I'm scared. Then she reframed what the fear meant. This fear is evidence that I'm doing something that matters, something that stretches me. The fear isn't a warning to stop. It's a sign that I'm growing. When Sophia walked onto the TEDx stage, she was still scared, but she was also present. She made eye contact with people in the audience. She delivered her opening lines, and then something magical happened. She forgot to be scared. She got caught up in the ideas she was sharing, the stories she was telling, the message she wanted people to hear. The fear was still there in the background, but it wasn't running the show anymore. Her talk was about the invisible barriers we construct through limiting beliefs and how to recognize and challenge them. She shared her own story, the turned-down promotions, the perfectionism, the sense of being a fraud, but she also shared the specific practices that had helped her change, questioning beliefs instead of accepting them, gathering evidence against them, acting as if they weren't true, and developing a different relationship with difficult thoughts. The response was overwhelming. The video of her talk was viewed hundreds of thousands of times. She received messages from people all over the world, sharing their own stories of limiting beliefs and thanking her for making them feel less alone. Several people told her that her talk had given them the courage to pursue opportunities they'd been avoiding. One woman wrote, "I've been turning down promotions for 5 years because I didn't think I was ready. After watching your talk, I realized I was ready 3 years ago. I was just scared. I just accepted a director position. Thank you for helping me see the difference between real limitations and imagined ones." Reading these messages, Sophia realized something profound. When you do the work of challenging your own limiting beliefs, you don't just change your own life, you give others permission to change theirs. Vulnerability and honesty about your struggles creates a ripple effect. It makes other people feel less alone and more courageous. This realization shaped how Sophia approached the rest of her career. She became increasingly intentional about creating cultures where limiting beliefs could be openly discussed and challenged. She started a mentorship program at her company specifically focused on helping high potential employees identify and work through the beliefs that were holding them back. She shared her own ongoing struggles in team meetings, normalizing the fact that growth is never finished and doubt never completely disappears. One of her mentees, a young man named David, particularly stood out. David was brilliant, creative, strategic, great with people, but he was also gay and had grown up in a conservative community where he'd learned to hide parts of himself and make himself palatable to others. He'd brought this pattern into his professional life, dimming his personality and second-guessing his ideas because he didn't want to be too much. In one of their mentoring sessions, David confessed, "I feel like I'm performing all the time, like the professional version of me is this toned-down, acceptable version, and I'm exhausted from maintaining it. But I'm afraid if I show up more authentically, people won't take me seriously or won't want to work with me." Sophia recognized this pattern immediately. "What you're describing is a limiting belief," she said, "the belief that you have to hide parts of yourself to be accepted. Can I ask, what evidence do you have that this is true in our current workplace?" David thought about it. "Honestly, none. The company has been super inclusive. I assume people won't like the real me." So, the belief formed in an environment where it might have been protective, your childhood community. But you're still operating by those rules, even though you're in a completely different context. Now, that's how limiting beliefs work. They persist long after the conditions that created them have changed. Over the following months, David worked on bringing more of his authentic self to work. He stopped censoring his humor. He decorated his office with photos and art that reflected his actual interests. He spoke up about his perspective without softening it, and gradually he discovered what Sophia had learned, that authenticity doesn't undermine professional credibility. If anything, it enhances it, because people trust and connect with genuine humans more than polished personas. David's transformation reminded Sophia that limiting beliefs aren't just about competence and capability, they're also about belonging and worthiness. We all carry beliefs about whether we're acceptable as we are, whether we have to earn our place in the world, whether there's something fundamentally wrong with us that we need to hide or fix. These beliefs shape how we show up in every domain of life. As Sophia approached her mid-40s, she found herself reflecting on the decade of intentional growth she'd undertaken. The change wasn't linear or clean. There were periods of backsliding where old patterns reasserted themselves. There were new situations that triggered doubts she thought she'd resolved. There were days when she still felt like a fraud or questioned whether she deserved her success, but the overall trajectory was clear. She'd moved from a person controlled by limiting beliefs to a person who could recognize and work with them. She'd learned that confidence isn't the absence of doubt, it's the ability to act effectively despite doubt. She'd discovered that self-worth isn't something you achieve or earn, it's something you claim by refusing to make yourself small anymore. Most importantly, she'd learned that the work of challenging limiting beliefs is never finished. New situations will always trigger old fears. New levels of responsibility will always activate new doubts. The goal isn't to reach some final state of perfect confidence where limiting beliefs no longer arise. The goal is to develop a practice of recognizing them, questioning them, and choosing your actions based on your values rather than your fears. One Tuesday morning, about 6 years into her journey of transformation, Sophia received an email that would test everything she'd learned. The CEO was stepping down, and the board was conducting a search for his replacement. The email came from the board chair, asking if Sophia would be interested in being considered for the position. She read the email 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each reading. Chief Executive Officer. The top position in the company, her name being considered alongside external candidates with decades of CEO experience. This wasn't just a promotion. This was a fundamental shift in identity and responsibility. This was the kind of opportunity she wouldn't have even allowed herself to imagine 10 years ago. Sophia's first instinct was to immediately decline. The familiar voice of self-doubt kicked in with full force. You're not qualified for this. You've never been a CEO before. You'll be in over your head. The board will regret even considering you. You'll embarrass yourself and damage your reputation. Stay where you are. At least you know you can handle being CMO. But now, unlike 10 years ago, Sophia recognized this voice for what it was. She sat at her desk, closed her eyes, and took several deep breaths. She acknowledged the fear. Yes, this is terrifying. This would be the biggest challenge I've ever taken on. Of course I'm scared. Then she asked herself the questions that had become her practice. Is this fear protecting me from real danger, or is it just my limiting beliefs, trying to keep me small? What would I do if I trusted myself? She thought about everything she'd learned over the past decade. She'd successfully led the marketing division through multiple market shifts. She'd taken the European expansion from concept to profitable operation. She'd managed complex stakeholder relationships at the board level. She'd mentored dozens of employees who'd gone on to leadership positions themselves. She'd proven again and again that she could handle challenges that initially seemed beyond her capabilities. But CEO? That felt different. That felt like a level where she'd finally be exposed as not quite good enough. Except it wasn't that exactly what she'd thought about becoming CMO and senior director before that. Every level had felt like the one where she'd finally hit her limit, and every time she'd been wrong. Sophia scheduled a call with Patricia, her executive coach. When she shared the CEO opportunity, Patricia asked a simple question. What's the worst that could happen if you throw your name in the ring? I could go through the whole interview process and not get it, Sophia said. That would be humiliating, would it? Or would it just be disappointing? Sophia thought about the distinction. Humiliation implied shame, a public revelation of inadequacy. Disappointment was just disappointment, a hope that didn't work out. I guess disappointment, she admitted. And what's the worst that could happen if you got the job? I could fail. I could make decisions that hurt the company. I could let down everyone who believed in me. Could you, or would you face challenges, make some mistakes, learn from them, and grow into the role the same way you've grown into every other role you've taken on? Sophia smiled despite herself. You're suggesting that my worst case scenario is actually just normal leadership reality? Exactly. Every CEO makes mistakes. Every CEO faces challenges they're not initially prepared for. The question isn't whether you'd be perfect from day one. The question is whether you have the capabilities, judgment, and character to do the job well over time. What does the evidence suggest? By the end of the conversation, Sophia had decided to put her name forward. Not because she felt completely confident. She didn't, but because she'd learned that waiting to feel ready was just another way limiting beliefs kept you stuck. She was as ready as anyone could be for a position they'd never held before. The rest would come from doing the work itself. The interview process was grueling. Sophia went through multiple rounds of interviews with board members, presentations on her strategic vision for the company, assessments of her leadership capabilities, and deep dives into her experience and judgment. Throughout the process, she had to fight the constant internal narrative that said, they're going to realize you're not actually CEO material. One particularly challenging moment came during a panel interview with 3 board members. One of them, a venture capitalist named Robert, who built and sold several companies, asked pointedly, "Sophia, you've done excellent work as CMO, but that's a functional role, not a general management role. What makes you think you can handle the full scope of CEO responsibilities, operations, finance, strategy, investor relations, all of it?" The old Sophia would have gotten defensive or tried to over-explain her qualifications. Instead, she took a breath and answered honestly, "You're right that I haven't held a general management role before. What I bring is deep business understanding across multiple functions, from leading the European expansion, strong board-level relationships from my time as CMO, proven ability to learn and grow into roles that initially stretched me, and a leadership style that builds strong teams and empowers people to do their best work." Would I have a learning curve in some areas? Absolutely. Am I capable of succeeding despite that learning curve? My track record suggests yes. Robert nodded slowly. Fair answer. Too many candidates try to pretend they know everything. I appreciate the honest assessment. After 6 weeks of interviews, deliberation, and waiting, Sophia got the call. The board had decided to offer her the position. She would become the next CEO, effective in 3 months after a transition period with the outgoing CEO. When she hung up the phone, Sophia sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Then she started crying, not from fear or doubt this time, but from the overwhelming recognition of how far she'd come. 10 years ago, she'd turned down a promotion to senior director because she was convinced she wasn't qualified. Now she was going to be CEO. The difference wasn't that she'd suddenly become more talented or capable. She'd always had those qualities. The difference was that she'd learned to stop believing the lies her limiting beliefs told her about what she could and couldn't do. The announcement of Sophia's appointment generated significant attention, both inside and outside the company. She was one of the youngest people to become CEO of a company this size. She was also a woman in an industry still dominated by men at the executive level. The press coverage ranged from celebratory to skeptical. Some articles praised her innovative marketing leadership and predicted she'd bring fresh perspective to the CEO role. Others questioned whether someone with a marketing background could handle the full complexity of running the company. Reading the skeptical articles triggered all of Sophia's old insecurities. There was something particularly painful about seeing your private doubts reflected in public commentary. One article in particular stung. A business journalist wrote that Sophia's appointment was a risky bet on potential rather than a safe choice of proven CEO experience. Part of her wanted to prove that journalists wrong through sheer force of will and perfection, but she recognized this impulse as another limiting belief, the need to prove her worth through flawless performance. Instead, Sophia did something different. She acknowledged, both to herself and in her first company-wide email as incoming CEO, that she had a learning curve ahead of her. "I'm not coming into this role pretending I have all the answers," she wrote. "I'm coming in with deep knowledge of this company, strong relationships across the organization, clear values about the kind of leader I want to be, and commitment to learning and growing into this role. I'm going to make mistakes. When I do, I'll own them, learn from them, and do better. I'm asking for your partnership in this journey." The response was overwhelmingly positive. Employees appreciated the honesty and vulnerability. Several board members told her the email demonstrated exactly the kind of authentic leadership they wanted to see, and the journalist who'd written a skeptical piece actually reached out to say that her response had changed his perspective. Leaders who could acknowledge uncertainty while still moving forward decisively were often more effective than those who projected false certainty. The 3-month transition period before Sophia officially became CEO was intense. She shadowed the outgoing CEO, learning the rhythms and responsibilities of the role. She met with every department head to understand their challenges and priorities. She spent time with major investors and board members, building relationships and understanding their expectations. And she worked with Patricia on managing the psychological challenges of stepping into the most visible high-stakes position she'd ever held. One conversation with the outgoing CEO, Michael, particularly stuck with her. They were having coffee during a quiet moment in the transition. Michael said, "Can I share something I wish someone had told me when I became CEO?" "Please," Sophia said. "The job is impossible. There's literally no way to do everything that needs to be done, address every stakeholder concern, and make every decision perfectly. You will disappoint people. You will make mistakes. You will face situations where every option has significant downsides. The trick is accepting that impossibility and doing your best anyway, without letting the weight of it crush you." Sophia nodded slowly. "That's both eerie and weirdly reassuring," Michael smiled. "I know. It's terrifying because there's no formula for perfect performance. But it's reassuring because it means you can stop trying to be perfect. Nobody is. The CEOs who look like they have it all figured out are just better at hiding their doubts and struggles. Don't fall into that trap. Your honesty about the challenges will serve you better than pretending you have all the answers." When Sophia officially stepped into the CEO role, she felt simultaneously excited and overwhelmed. Her first few months were a blur of meetings, decisions, crises to manage, and opportunities to evaluate. She made some good calls, and some questionable ones. She navigated some situations skillfully and handled others clumsily. In other words, she was a normal new CEO, learning on the job. About 4 months into her tenure, Sophia faced her first major crisis. A product defect had been discovered that potentially affected hundreds of thousands of customers. The issue hadn't caused any injuries yet, but it could if not addressed immediately. Sophia had to decide whether to issue a massive recall, which would cost tens of millions of dollars and damage the company's reputation, or try to fix the issue through a less visible repair program. The legal team was divided on the best approach. The CFO was worried about the financial impact. The head of operations was concerned about the logistical nightmare of a recall. Everyone had legitimate concerns and strong opinions, and ultimately the decision rested with Sophia. She felt the full weight of the responsibility. This wasn't about her career or her limiting beliefs anymore. This was about potentially putting people at risk or costing the company enormous amounts of money. Either choice had serious consequences. The old limiting beliefs tried to kick in. You're not qualified to make this call. A real CEO would know what to do. You're going to make the wrong decision, and people will get hurt, or the company will suffer. But Sophia had learned to distinguish between a limiting belief voice and legitimate concern. Yes, this was a difficult decision, but she wasn't unqualified to make it. She had all the relevant information. She'd consulted with experts. She understood the trade-offs. What she didn't have was certainty about which choice was objectively correct, but nobody would have that. This was exactly the kind of ambiguous high-stakes decision that defined leadership. Sophia made the call to do a full recall. It was expensive and embarrassing, but it was the right thing to do to ensure customer safety. When she announced the decision, the stock price dropped. The board received criticism. Industry analysts questioned the necessity of such an extensive recall, but no customers were harmed. And over time, the company's reputation for putting safety first actually strengthened customer loyalty. More importantly, Sophia learned something crucial about CEO-level decision-making. You can't wait for certainty. You gather the best information you can, consult people you trust, consider the values and priorities that should guide the decision, and then you make the call. Sometimes you'll be right, sometimes you'll be wrong. Either way, you take responsibility for the outcome and move forward. About a year into her role as CEO, Sophia had coffee with Marcus, her old colleague who'd been the first to challenge her about turning down promotions. He'd since moved to another company, but they'd stayed in touch. "How's it going?" he asked. "From the outside, it looks like you're doing great, but I want to know how it actually feels." Sophia thought carefully before answering. "Honestly, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. Every day, there are moments when I question whether I made the right decision. There are meetings where I feel completely out of my depth. There are nights when I can't sleep because I'm worried about a strategic choice, or a personnel issue, or a market shift." "So you regret taking the job?" "No," Sophia said firmly. "Not at all. Because here's what I've realized. That difficulty isn't a sign I'm not cut out for this. It's just what the job is. Every CEO experiences what I'm experiencing. The difference is that now I know difficulty doesn't mean I'm failing. It just means I'm doing something challenging and important." She paused, then added, "You know what's different from 10 years ago? When hard things happen now, I don't immediately think, this is happening because I'm not good enough. I think, this is a hard situation. What resources and capabilities do I need to bring to address it?" It's a completely different frame. Marcus smiled. "That's huge growth. Sophia, you've fundamentally changed your relationship with challenge and difficulty." This insight crystallized something important for Sophia. Challenging limiting beliefs wasn't ultimately about achieving perfect confidence or eliminating self-doubt. It was about developing a healthier relationship with difficulty, uncertainty, and imperfection. It was about learning that you could function effectively, even when things were hard, even when you weren't sure, even when you made mistakes. Around this time, Sophia started a new practice. Every Sunday evening, she would write in a journal about the challenges of the past week and how she'd handled them. But instead of focusing on what went wrong or what she should have done better, she focused on evidence of her capability. What problems had she solved? What decisions had she made, despite uncertainty? What challenges had she navigated successfully? What did she learn? This practice served as a counterweight to the natural human tendency to focus on failures and overlook successes. Sophia realized that her brain was still wired to notice threats and inadequacies. That was just how brains worked for survival purposes, but she could intentionally direct her attention to evidence of capability and growth. Over time, this practice helped her build a more balanced and accurate self-assessment. One particularly meaningful entry came after a difficult board meeting, where Sophia had to deliver disappointing quarterly results. The company hadn't met revenue targets due to unexpected market headwinds. The board had been supportive, but concerned. One board member had asked tough questions about whether the strategic direction needed to be reconsidered. In the moment, Sophia had felt defensive and inadequate, like she was being called out for not being a good enough CEO. But when she wrote about it in her journal that Sunday, she saw it differently. The board member hadn't been attacking her. He'd been doing his job pushing leadership to think critically about strategy during challenging times, and she'd actually handled it well. She'd acknowledged the disappointing results, honestly, explained the factors that had contributed to the shortfall, outlined the adjustments being made, and remained open to strategic discussion without getting defensive or making excuses. Writing this down, Sophia realized she'd just demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership she aspired to. Honest, accountable, responsive to feedback, and resilient in the face of setbacks. The old Sophia would have spent days spiraling about that board meeting, convinced it was evident she wasn't cut out for the CEO role. The new Sophia could recognize it as a challenging but ultimately successful navigation of a difficult situation. As Sophia moved through her second year as CEO, she found herself increasingly focused on systemic and cultural change, rather than just her own personal development. She'd learned that individual transformation was important, but it had limited impact if the organizational culture still reinforced limiting beliefs and dysfunctional patterns. She noticed, for example, that the company's performance review process was heavily focused on identifying weaknesses and areas for improvement. While this was intended to drive development, the actual effect was that people felt constantly inadequate. High performers would receive mostly positive feedback, but then fixate on the one or two areas flagged for improvement. The system reinforced the limiting belief that you're only as good as your worst capability. Sophia worked with the HR team to redesign the performance process around a strengths-based approach. Instead of starting with what people were bad at, the new process started with what they were excellent at and how those strengths could be leveraged more effectively. Development conversations focused on building from strengths rather than fixing weakness. For areas that genuinely needed improvement, the frame was, how can we get you to good enough in this area so it doesn't hold you back, rather than you need to become excellent at everything. The impact was remarkable. Employee engagement scores improved. People felt more valued and motivated, and somewhat counterintuitively, performance improved. When people focused on developing their strengths rather than obsessing over their weaknesses. They became more effective overall. Sophia also noticed patterns in who was getting promoted and who wasn't. Despite the company's stated commitment to diversity, leadership positions were still disproportionately held by a narrow demographic. When she dug into the data and talked to people, a pattern emerged. Members of underrepresented groups were less likely to apply for promotions or stretch assignments. When asked why, they often cited not feeling ready enough or qualified enough. This was the systemic manifestation of limiting beliefs. Decades of subtle and not so subtle messages had convinced many talented people that they didn't belong in leadership, that they had to be twice as good to be considered half as qualified, that they needed to wait until they were perfectly prepared before raising their hand for opportunities. Meanwhile, others had been socialized to believe they belonged anywhere they wanted to be, regardless of their actual preparation level. Sophia launched an initiative called Challenge You're Ready. The premise was simple. If you're waiting until you feel completely ready before pursuing an opportunity, you're probably letting limiting beliefs hold you back. The initiative included workshops on recognizing limiting beliefs, mentorship programs, pairing high-potential employees with senior leaders who could help them navigate self-doubt, and transparent criteria for promotions so people could make informed assessments of their readiness rather than operating on feeling. The initiative wasn't a magic solution. Systemic inequities ran deep and would take years to fully address, but it created language and permission for people to talk about the psychological barriers that were holding them back. It normalized the experience of imposter syndrome and self-doubt, and it explicitly reframed ambition as positive rather than somehow threatening or inappropriate. One young woman who went through the Challenge You're Ready program, an engineer named Keisha, approached Sophia at a company event months later. "I want to thank you for that program," she said. "For my entire career, I've been the only black woman in most rooms I've been in, and I internalized the message that I had to be perfect, that I couldn't make mistakes, that I had to work twice as hard to prove I belonged. That program helped me see those beliefs for what they were, protective mechanisms that actually limited me. I just accepted a promotion to engineering director, and I'm not waiting until I feel perfectly ready anymore." Hearing stories like Keisha's reminded Sophia why challenging limiting beliefs mattered beyond individual career success. These beliefs didn't exist in isolation. They were shaped by systems, cultures, and histories. When organizations actively worked to identify and counter the messages that created limiting beliefs, especially for people from marginalized groups, they didn't just help individuals, they shifted toward justice and equity. Around her third anniversary as CEO, Sophia received an invitation that brought her full circle. The business school at her alma mater asked her to give the commencement address to graduating MBA students. She would be speaking to hundreds of soon-to-be business leaders at the start of their careers, exactly the position she'd been in over 20 years ago, when her own limiting beliefs were just beginning to solidify. Sophia spent weeks crafting her commencement address. She wanted to share something genuinely useful, not just platitudes about following your dreams or working hard. Finally, she settled on speaking about the invisible barriers we construct through limiting beliefs, and how to recognize and dismantle them before they cost you decades of unnecessary struggle. Standing at the podium, Looking out at all those young, hopeful faces, Sophia felt the weight of what she wanted to convey. She began with a question. How many of you have already started telling yourselves stories about what you can't do, who you can't be, or where you don't belong? Nearly every hand went up. The audience laughed nervously, recognizing themselves. Good, Sophia continued. At least you're aware of it, because here's what I wish someone had told me when I was sitting where you are. The biggest obstacles you'll face in your career won't be external, they'll be the beliefs you carry about yourself. Beliefs that feel like truth, but are actually just stories you've learned to tell yourself. She shared her own story, not the highlight reel version that might appear in a press release, but the messy, honest version that included 3 turned-down promotions, years of imposter syndrome, and a near-constant battle with the voice that said she wasn't enough. She talked about the yellow sticky note that had started her journey of questioning her limiting beliefs. She described the practices and frameworks that had helped her change her relationship with self-doubt, but she didn't present it as a tidy narrative with a clear endpoint. I'm standing here as CEO of a major company, she told the graduates, and I still have moments when the old, limiting beliefs come back. Just last week, I was preparing for a presentation to our board, and the thought came up, they're going to realize you don't actually know what you're doing. After all these years, that voice still shows up. She paused to let that sink in. The difference is that now I recognize it as just a thought, not the truth. I can notice it, acknowledge it, and then do what needs to be done anyway. That's the skill I most want you to develop. Not the elimination of self-doubt, but the ability to function effectively despite it. Sophia ended her address with a challenge. Your assignment, if you choose to accept it, is to notice the limiting beliefs you're carrying, write them down, examine them critically. Ask yourself what evidence supports them and what evidence contradicts them, and then start making decisions based on your values and capability rather than your fears. Do this consistently, and you'll be amazed at how much more is possible than you currently believe. The response to her commencement address was powerful. Multiple students approached her afterward to share their own struggles with limiting beliefs and thank her for making them feel less alone. One student said something that particularly struck Sophia. I thought I was the only one who felt this way. I thought everyone else had confidence figured out, and I was the only one faking it. Thank you for showing me that's not true. This reaction highlighted something Sophia had come to understand deeply. One of the most pernicious aspects of limiting beliefs is the isolation they create. We assume our self-doubt is unique evidence of our inadequacy, rather than a nearly universal human experience. When leaders are willing to be honest about their struggles, not in a way that undermines confidence in their capabilities, but in a way that humanizes the leadership journey, they help dissolve that isolation and create permission for others to be equally honest. In the months following her commencement address, Sophia received hundreds of emails and messages from people who'd watched the video or read the transcript. Many shared their own stories of limiting beliefs, the opportunities they'd turned down, the dreams they'd abandoned, the ways they'd made themselves smaller than they needed to be. But what struck Sophia most were the messages from people saying they'd started to make different choices after hearing her talk. One message in particular came from a woman named Jennifer, who worked at a tech startup. She wrote, I've been the lead designer at my company for 3 years. Last month, our CEO asked me if I'd be interested in a VP role, overseeing the entire design and product team. My immediate reaction was to say no. I'm not ready. I don't have management experience. I'm not qualified. But then I remembered your commencement speech. I asked myself, are these beliefs true, or am I just scared? I realized I was scared, but I also realized I had the capabilities to succeed in that role if I was willing to learn. I said yes. I start next month. Thank you for helping me see the difference between real limitations and imagined ones. Reading messages like Jennifer's, Sophia understood that the impact of challenging your own limiting beliefs extended far beyond your personal success. When you modeled that possibility, when you showed that growth was achievable, even when you felt uncertain and afraid, you gave others permission to attempt their own growth. Leadership wasn't just about business strategy or managing teams. It was about demonstrating what becomes possible when you refuse to accept false limits. As Sophia entered her 4th year as CEO, she found herself thinking about the legacy, not in a grandiose sense of how she'd be remembered, but in a practical sense of what would outlast her tenure. What changes could she implement that would continue shaping the organization positively long after she'd moved on? She decided to codify many of the practices and frameworks that had helped her challenge limiting beliefs into the company's leadership development programs. Instead of treating personal psychology as separate from professional development, the programs would integrate them. Leaders would learn to recognize their own limiting beliefs and help their team members recognize theirs. Performance conversations would include discussion of what beliefs might be holding people back. Promotion decisions would consider not just past performance, but willingness to challenge oneself and grow. Most radically, Sophia introduced a practice called failure reflections into leadership meetings. Once a quarter, each executive leader would share a significant mistake they'd made, what they'd learned from it, and how they were applying that learning going forward. The purpose wasn't to shame or criticize. It was to normalize failure as part of growth and reduce the stigma around admitting mistakes. The first failure reflection session was awkward. Executives were accustomed to presenting their successes and downplaying their failures. Sophia went first, sharing a strategic decision she'd made that hadn't worked out as planned and had cost the company significant resources. She was specific about what she'd learned and how she was approaching similar decisions differently now. Her vulnerability gave others permission to be equally honest. Over time, these sessions became some of the most valuable leadership development time the executive teams spent together. They learned from each other's mistakes without having to make them all themselves. They developed psychological safety and trust that made collaboration more effective, and they modeled for the entire organization that failure wasn't a final judgment, it was data for improvement. One of Sophia's direct reports, a CFO named Thomas, told her after one of these sessions, "You know what's interesting? I used to spend so much energy hiding my mistakes and trying to look competent all the time. It was exhausting. Now that we're openly discussing failures and learning from them, I actually feel more confident, not less. I'm not wasting energy on impression management. I can just focus on actually doing good work and getting better." This insight captured something profound about limiting beliefs. They often drive behaviors that actually undermine the competence and confidence we're trying to project. Perfectionism makes us rigid and defensive. Fear of failure makes us avoid necessary risks. Imposter syndrome makes us hesitant to speak up or take credit. When we challenge those limiting beliefs and adopt more functional ones, we don't just feel better, we actually perform better. Around this time, Sophia's mother called with news that her father had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. The diagnosis wasn't entirely unexpected. There had been subtle signs for a year, but it still hit Sophia hard. She flew home to Ohio to spend time with her parents and help them navigate the medical system and plan for the future. Sitting with her father one evening, watching him struggle to remember a word he wanted, Sophia felt overwhelmed by a complicated mix of emotions: grief, fear, love, and a strange kind of urgency. Time was limited. Whatever conversations needed to happen, whatever healing needed to occur, it needed to happen now while her father could still engage fully. "Dad," she said, taking his hand, "I want to tell you something. You've been such an important part of my journey, even in ways you didn't know about. Remember how I told you about that time you sighed over my homework, and I interpreted it as me not being smart enough? That belief shaped so much of my life, but I want you to know I don't carry that anymore. I've learned that those beliefs weren't truth, just interpretations I made as a child, and more importantly, I want to say thank you." Her father looked confused. "Thank you? For what?" "For being human. For having your own struggles and limitations. For being imperfect, because watching you these past few years, seeing you acknowledge your own fears and mistakes and growth, taught me that nobody has it all figured out, not even parents. We're all just doing our best and learning as we go." That realization freed me in ways I can't fully explain. Her father's eyes filled with tears. "I always worried I messed you kids up somehow, that my own issues got passed down to you. I tried so hard to be a good father, but I know I made a lot of mistakes." "You did mess us up a little," Sophia said with a gentle smile. "But that's okay. Every parent does. The gift you've given me is the ability to recognize it, understand it, and choose something different. That's not a failure. That's breaking cycles. That's growth." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands. Then her father said, "I'm proud of you, Sophia, not just for becoming CEO or achieving all the things you've achieved. I'm proud of you for doing the hard work of examining yourself and changing patterns. That takes more courage than any promotion." Those words, coming from her father at this vulnerable time, meant more to Sophia than any professional accolade, because at the core of her journey of challenging limiting beliefs was a desire to break free from patterns that had been passed down through generations, patterns of self-doubt, of perfectionism, of believing you had to earn your worth rather than claiming it as your birthright. Flying back to New York after that visit, Sophia found herself thinking about the generational nature of limiting beliefs. Her father had carried beliefs from his father. She'd absorbed beliefs from both of them, but she was actively working to transform those patterns so they wouldn't get passed to the next generation. Whether through her leadership at the company, her mentorship of younger professionals, or simply how she showed up in the world, she was modeling a different possibility. In her 5th year as CEO, the company faced its biggest challenge yet. A major competitor launched a product that was significantly better than anything in their current portfolio. Market share started eroding quickly. Investors were getting nervous. The board was asking tough questions about whether Sophia's strategic direction had been correct. Internally, there was finger-pointing and fear about potential layoffs. This was exactly the kind of high-visibility crisis where limiting beliefs would have crushed the old Sophia. The voice would have said, "See, you weren't actually qualified to be CEO." A real leader would have anticipated this competitive threat. "You're going to be fired. You failed." And that voice might have been loud enough to actually undermine her ability to lead effectively through the crisis. But Sophia had spent years building psychological resilience and practices for working with difficult thoughts and emotions. When the voice of limiting beliefs showed up, and it definitely showed up, she could recognize it, acknowledge it, and then set it aside to focus on what actually needed to be done. She called an emergency strategy session with her leadership team. Instead of pretending she had all the answers or trying to project false confidence, she was direct. "This is a serious competitive threat. We didn't see it coming, and that's on us, primarily on me as CEO. Now we need to decide how to respond. I don't have a fully formed plan yet. I need your best thinking and collaboration to figure this out together. Let's be honest about the severity of the situation, creative about possible responses, and committed to making quick decisions even when we're not entirely certain. This is going to be hard. Let's do it anyway." The honesty disarmed the defensive dynamics that often emerge during crises. People stopped worrying about covering themselves and started focusing on actually solving the problem. They spent 2 intense days brainstorming, debating, analyzing, and ultimately crafting a response strategy that involved both near-term tactical moves and longer-term strategic repositioning. The strategy wasn't perfect. No strategy ever is, but it was good enough, fast enough, and executed with enough commitment that the company stabilized and eventually recovered market position. More importantly, the way Sophia led through that crisis reinforced the kind of culture she'd been building, one where people could acknowledge difficult realities without spiraling into blame or despair, where uncertainty was accepted as part of complex problem solving, and where leadership meant bringing your best capabilities to a challenge, rather than pretending to have everything figured out. After the crisis passed, and the company was back on solid footing, one of the board members approached Sophia privately. "I want you to know," he said, "that how you handled this situation convinced me you're absolutely the right CEO for this company. A less mature leader would have gotten defensive or tried to downplay the severity or spent energy protecting their image. You just focused on solving the problem. That's real leadership." Sophia thanked him, but internally, she was amused. Real leadership looked a lot like what she'd once thought was weakness: admitting uncertainty, asking for help, acknowledging mistakes. The limiting belief that leaders had to project invulnerability, uncertainty, had been exactly wrong. Effective leadership often meant being willing to be vulnerable, uncertain, and imperfect, while still taking decisive action. As Sophia approached her 50s, now 6 years into her tenure as CEO, and over 15 years into her intentional journey of challenging limiting beliefs, she found herself in a reflective mood, What had she actually learned from all this personal work? What wisdom would she want to pass on? She started writing, not a business book or a memoir exactly, but something more personal, reflections on the journey from limiting beliefs to psychological freedom. She wrote in the early mornings before work, letting the thoughts flow without too much editing or structuring. The writing itself became another form of processing and integration. One section she found herself returning to and revising multiple times was about the relationship between limiting beliefs and safety. She wrote, "For most of my life, I thought my limiting beliefs were the problem, and I was the victim of them. But I've come to understand something more nuanced. These beliefs served a purpose. They protected me from risks that felt dangerous. If you never put yourself in challenging situations, you never have to face the possibility of failure or rejection. If you stay small and quiet, you're less likely to be criticized. If you don't pursue your biggest dreams, you can't be disappointed when you don't achieve them." She continued, "The limiting beliefs weren't inflicted on me by some external force. They were strategies I developed, often unconsciously, to feel safe in a world that sometimes felt threatening. The problem was that the safety came at an enormous cost. The cost of never fully becoming who I could be. Challenging, limiting beliefs meant being willing to give up that false safety in exchange for the possibility of real growth. It meant accepting that feeling scared or uncertain or vulnerable was just part of living fully, not a sign that something was wrong." Writing this, Sophia felt like she'd reached a deeper level of understanding. Limiting beliefs weren't character flaws or mental errors that needed to be fixed. They were outdated protective strategies that had once served a purpose, but now limited possibility. Approaching them with curiosity and compassion, rather than harsh judgment, made them easier to work with and ultimately transform. The writing project took on a life of its own. What started as private reflection became something Sophia wanted to share more broadly. She worked with a publisher to turn her reflections into a book aimed at professionals struggling with self-doubt and limiting beliefs. The book, which she titled Believing Bigger, shared her personal journey, but also included practical frameworks, exercises, and strategies that readers could apply to their own lives. When the book came out, the response was overwhelming. It hit bestseller lists in multiple countries. Sophia was invited to speak at conferences, appear on podcasts, and write articles for major publications. But the most meaningful responses came in the form of personal messages from readers who said the book had helped them recognize and challenge their own limiting beliefs. One message came from a man in his 60s who wrote, "I'm at the end of my career, not the beginning, but reading your book made me realize I've spent 40 years letting limiting beliefs keep me smaller than I needed to be. It's too late to change my career trajectory, but it's not too late to change how I show up in my relationships, my community involvement, and my own self-perception. Thank you for helping me see that it's never too late to challenge beliefs that no longer serve you." This message moved Sophia deeply. She'd initially thought of limiting beliefs as primarily a professional challenge, something that held people back in their careers, but they were much more pervasive than that. They shaped how people showed up in relationships, how they took care of themselves, how they engaged with their communities, how they thought about their worth and potential. Challenging limiting beliefs wasn't just about career success, it was about living a more full and authentic life. in every domain. As Sophia reflected on her journey from the woman who turned down 3 promotions to someone writing books and giving keynotes about overcoming limiting beliefs, she was struck by how non-linear and ongoing the process had been. She hadn't followed a clean path from limited to liberated. She'd taken 2 steps forward and 1 step back, had moments of breakthrough followed by periods of backsliding, and continually faced new situations that triggered old patterns. But the overall direction was clear. She'd developed what psychologists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe her own thoughts and recognize them as mental events rather than absolute truths. She'd built practices for questioning beliefs, gathering counter-evidence, and choosing actions based on values rather than fears. She'd learned to function effectively, even in the presence of uncertainty, discomfort, and imperfection. Most importantly, she'd discovered that the goal wasn't to eliminate limiting beliefs entirely. The goal was to change your relationship with them, so they no longer controlled your choices. The voice that said you can't do this would probably never completely disappear, but it no longer had the power to stop her from trying. Looking back at that crumpled yellow note from so many years ago, the one that had asked, "Why am I so afraid?" Sophia understood now that the question itself had been the beginning of transformation, because you can't change what you don't notice. You can't challenge what you don't question. The willingness to examine your fears and beliefs, even when it's uncomfortable, is the first and most essential step toward growth. And so, standing in her office one evening, looking out at the city lights, Sophia thought about all the people out there struggling with their own limiting beliefs, the opportunities they were turning down, the dreams they were abandoning, the ways they were making themselves smaller than they needed to be. She thought about the voice in their heads telling them they weren't enough, weren't ready, weren't qualified, didn't belong. To all of them, she wished she could say, "That voice is lying to you. It feels like truth, because you've believed it for so long. But it's just a story, one you can choose to question and ultimately rewrite. You are more capable than you think. You are more resilient than you know. You deserve to take up space in the world, to pursue your goals despite uncertainty, to fail and try again without it defining your worth. The only real limitation is the belief in limitation itself. Everything else is just fear dressed up as fact, and fear, while it may never completely disappear, doesn't have to have the final say in how you live your life. That was the truth. Sophia had spent 15 years learning. That was the message she hoped to spend the rest of her life sharing, because if her journey had taught her anything, it was this: when one person breaks free from limiting beliefs, they create possibility, not just for themselves, but for everyone watching. They prove that change is possible. They model what courage looks like. They give others permission to believe bigger too. And that, ultimately, was the most important form of leadership, showing people what becomes possible when you refuse to accept false limits on what you can do, who you can be, or what you can become. The story of how Sophia broke free from her limiting beliefs isn't a story about becoming someone new. It's a story about becoming more fully herself, the person she always had the potential to be, before fear and false beliefs got in the way. It's a story about learning that confidence isn't a prerequisite for action. It's a result of it. It's a story about discovering that the only real limitation is the belief in limitation itself, and perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that wherever you are in your own journey, whatever limiting beliefs are holding you back, they're not permanent, they're not facts, they're just stories, and stories can be rewritten, one brave decision at a time.